Welcome back. In today's episode, we have Dr. Megan Cole, who is going to help us address water concerns in relation to the 9 planetary boundaries. Dr. Megan Cole, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you have a very interesting story in how what you do and how you started ties into the 9 planetary boundaries. Could you please share your story?
Sure. Well, I started work on the planetary boundaries about halfway through my career. I first started in the mining industry as a geologist, a geotechnical engineer. I worked on a mine, a platinum mine, and then in the head office. And then I moved to Oxford with my husband. He had a job there, and he worked for Oxfam. And they were really interested in the planetary boundaries, and I started working at the University of Oxford on climate change. And then I was given the opportunity to do a PhD at Oxford, and so I had the idea to work on planetary boundaries. And my husband was actually working with Kate Raworth, who developed the donut, which was taking the planetary boundaries and adding in the social elements, the social foundation. So I got to work with her and engage with sort of the global leaders on this topic. So spent nearly 4 years in my PhD looking at planetary boundaries and how to take this big global idea, which was really an advocacy tool for policymakers. How do we take that from a global level down to the national level? And so I looked at South Africa as this case study of a national version of the planetary boundaries. And then found that wasn't good enough. We have to look at provinces and we have to look at the local level. And zoomed in on water because it's uniquely both an environmental issue and a social issue in this planetary boundaries and donut space.
So what were the challenges you're finding in the research that the global north had done exclusively, without the global south, when you started doing research on the provincial and local level?
Yeah, well, so interestingly, planetary boundaries came out of the world experts on global environmental change, and they were all sitting in Europe and America. So it was quite a northern perspective, and saying we have for 300 years we've been pushing or using the planet's resources too much. We're now hitting tipping points so the key thing with a tipping point is it's irreversible change. It means you can't go back. So like with climate change, the general talk is of, say, that the temperature will go up so much that the ice caps will melt, the icebergs will melt, we'll get sea level rise, and you cannot go back. You cannot put them back again. So their idea in planetary boundary was saying, okay, well, what about things apart from climate change? What are those tipping points? What other environmental resources and change do we need to think about? But it was coming from this idea of we have used up the Earth's resources and now we have to pull back. And when you take that into the global south, the developing country context, this message doesn't work. You can't go to a policymaker in Malawi and say, I'm sorry, you cannot burn coal and make electricity to give your people access, because we've crossed a planetary boundary. That doesn't work. And that's where Kate Raworth brought in the donut, which is this idea of and we've got an environmental ceiling, which are planetary boundaries, and then we've got a social floor. And we've got millions and millions of people in the world living under the social floor. They don't have access to water, they don't have access to sanitation, they don't have access to electricity, they don't have a job, they don't have an income, they're living in poverty. And it's not okay to say you have to have less because the global north, Europe, America has used up all these resources when these people are still living in poverty. So her idea was to put the two together so it makes this donut shape of a social floor and an environmental ceiling. So that what I wanted to do was say, okay, let's take that to a developing country like South Africa, and test this planetary boundaries and this donut concept here, and how could we use it to help our policymakers make decisions that'll help us manage our environmental resources, but also support our people's human development.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the data that you're finding in terms of the usage and the inequality of usage?
Yeah, so when I zoomed in on to the local level, I looked at water in a lot of detail to try and explore the inequalities, because it's all very well having a national picture, but that still hides huge amount of variation and a huge amount of inequality. And South Africa is a fantastic case study for that, because we are, in terms of income, we're known as the most unequal, one of the most unequal countries in the world. And we just have this huge diversity of both in terms of our natural environment, but also our people. So I looked particularly at water access and water use across the country. And so we see, in terms of water access, so how many people actually have tap water, basically. It's piped water in their home or in their dwelling or close in their yard. And the numbers range from 0 to 100%, depending where you're looking, if you're looking at the local level. So someone sitting in a rich suburb in a city, they all have, the entire suburb has access to water. If you're sitting in a rural village, you're going and getting your water out of a stream still. There's still a lot of people in our country who go and use buckets and collect water out of streams. So there's this inequality in access, but that translates into an inequality in water use. And there we saw variation from 30, some people use 30 litres per person per day, which is about the absolute minimum recommended by the World Health Organization. And if anyone remembers the Cape Town drought, we were asked to limit our water use to 50 litres per day. I think that was quite a shock for a lot of people, not for some who already live in that space. But that's way less than most of us use most of the time. And then that ranged up to about 2,000 litres per person per day. And those were in interestingly, they were mining communities, but situated in very dry areas in the Northern Cape, but next to the Orange River. So they've got a huge amount of water supply, and there's no demand except for the mine and the town. There's just no other people. So when your supply far exceeds your demand, then you can use a lot of water. It doesn't matter. So this local context is hugely important. You can't just apply this one global limit to every community when, the context is so different in different areas.
So based on the research and studies done in South Africa, would we be able to infer any of that data to the rest of Africa?
Yeah, well, I think we're going to use it for the whole world, I think, because South Africa is a great case study because of its variation and inequality. So while you see some parts of our country look like Europe or the States, so what we see there applies to the rich world. But other parts of our country look like parts of Africa, the poorest parts of Africa. So while we're one of the most diverse in the world, that allows us to, what we learn here, we can apply to other places. And particularly the sort of, say, informal settlements or townships, that would be very applicable to the rest of Africa, where you get, in large cities, you start to get slums. So the issues around water use and water access, what we see here can apply there. In the same way that what we see in our high-end suburbs applies to London and New York and whatever. So it's actually a great country. One of the positives of our country is we can use what we learn here all over the world.
So how like we did mention that every corporation is different and obviously every community is different. How differently, or do you have a broad approach to how you bring these issues to the big corporates and how you bring the issues to local communities?
So yeah, in the past 2 years, I've developed a tool with a student of mine called the Mine Closure Atlas, which is this online interactive map which has all the information on all our mines, and then all the information that would inform risk around the environment and risk around society. And that we designed it so it could be used by communities. So we developed it to work on smartphones, so you could go out into a mining community, open up the map, zoom in onto the mine and say, okay, this is your mine, this is when it's closing. Now let's look at water. And there's all these different layers. We've got 65 different layers of information, data sets sitting in there. A lot of them on water, also on biodiversity. We've got protected areas in there, conservation areas, important bird areas, all the national data sets, global data sets we have around the environment. They're all in there. And it's designed so anyone you can sit with the CEO in his office saying, here, this is what's happening in your area and your mines, or you can sit with someone in the community with the exact same tool and all the same data. And to me, I'm passionate about data and saying there's a lot of narratives, and a lot of them are quite negative, but they're not based on the actual evidence or data. And what I've found, taking just the data and packaging it in a way that people can understand it, and it's meaningful to them, it suddenly gets the message across, and it changes their perspective. So an example, I've done this work on mine closure and looking at all the mining communities and how many people are going to be impacted when a mine closes. So particularly coal, but I've looked at all the commodities. But so in terms of coal mines, there are 2.8 million people who live next to a coal mine, who are affected by a coal mine, who have people who work on a coal mine. When those mines close, you have 2.8 million people who are going to be affected. Anyway, so I'd put this data in a way in maps and in nice graphics and presented it to an executive from one of the mining companies. And he was amazed. He said he's never seen that data before. And he said his words were that this showed him the scale of the challenge they're facing. And I was amazed because I thought they would have already known all of this. Because I thought, well, if you're running a coal mining company, surely this kind of stuff you look at. But no one else was looking at this. They generally just focus on their one mine and their one community. But the scale of the challenge for us as a country is 90,000 jobs and 2.8 million people. So there's this real value of looking at the data and doing the science, but then it's really important how you communicate that, how you package that for different people. So how to get it into the boardroom, because he said, I must take this to my exco. The board must see these numbers. So which is very different if you go to a community. They actually just want to know, mostly in the communities, they don't have the knowledge. They know they've heard on the grapevine the mine might close. They don't know when. They don't know how many jobs will be affected. They've heard there are going to be solar panels put up. Who's going to do them? There's a lot of uncertainty and this lack of knowledge, I think. And that's just giving them the knowledge, I think, is a massive step forward. Just saying, well, here, come and look. This is when they're closing. This is, who's going to be affected. This is, and like in the Atlas, we've got all the renewable energy plants that are going up. Yeah, so there are different approaches.
So you said the CEOs some are shocked and that they didn't see the data before. With the local communities, what is the sentiment more like there? Were they aware at all, and how are they feeling about?
So I don't work directly with the communities. I've presented the work to civil society organizations, so people who represent the communities. And there, I think it's less of there's a lack of understanding of the point of view of the mining company. The fact that the coal is actually, a lot of mines are going to close because there will be no more coal. So the workers in the communities want the mine to continue because they bring huge benefits to their community. And they're not so worried about climate change because they're worried about their livelihoods. But they don't have this understanding of what's going on in the corporate boardrooms where they have to make financial and economic decisions. Can they actually keep this mine going. Well, they can't because there's going to be no more coal, or it's uneconomic. They're making a loss. So there's, and this is what I've done for my whole career really, is trying to be the bridge builder, the person in between saying, okay, I understand your situation and I understand your situation. Now I'm going to try and get you two to understand each other. And that's really challenging, partly because of different languages. People use different words for the same thing. So a lot gets lost in translation. But then also a lot of people don't want to. They've got their view. They don't really want to have to change it. And you get that from all sides.
Are there any tactics you've tried or any ways you found a way trying to get the message across?
I mean, just personally, I think it's important, but I need to understand them first. There's a lot of arrogance from different sectors about their ways best or they know best. And for me, so let me just understand these people, where they're coming from. Let me think first about why are they upset about this? Why are they saying that? And I think so often in meetings I'll say, remember, it's more complex than you think. Like, it's always more complex than you think. So just trying to take the time to actually understand what's going on, but in the details, before jumping to conclusions and you may have to change your mind.
Are there any specific cases where you've brought research or an approach somewhere or an approach to a local community and they've actually implemented it?
I mean, this atlas is very new. We launched it in March, so it's a bit early still to say on that.
Share any examples of any approaches you've given to people?
So with that, I was hired by Oxford University to join this team to help them develop a national climate change strategy. And for them, it was a lot about trying to shift from an oil dependence onto sort of low carbon energy options. And that would help them access finance, but it would also help their national economy. And it would help create jobs. There were a huge amount of benefits. They just didn't know how to do it. But one of their key sectors they were interested in was mining, because it was a growth sector. Anyway, so I joined in to work on the energy and mining sectors in the strategy, and ended up running that project. And they were so we were based in Oxford, but then we spent a lot of time working in Rwanda closely with the Rwandan government. And I was always struck by how all these. So we had this very international team. We had an Australian, an American, an Englishman, me, a South African, a Welshman. This very diverse team. And we were all sitting in Rwanda helping them write their strategy. And I kept saying to them, like, I think you should be writing your strategy. I think we should be doing this.
The Rwandans should be doing it.
We should be doing this together. And so I actually spent a lot of time with the guys in the mining, the Department of Mining. I can't remember what they called it. Minirema, but it's all French. Anyway, and I'd say, well, let's go out together to the mines. Let's understand your local context. And it was so different to what I was used to here in South Africa. I've worked 2 kilometers underground in a platinum mine. I'm used to all kinds of large scale mining, and there it's very much artisanal and small scale, and the safety levels are very different. I was more scared going underground in Rwanda than I was going 2 kilometers down in Rustenburg. But just spending that time to go out with them, not just me flying in from the UK and sitting in an office and telling them what to do. Like, let's go out together. Let's go look at this, and then I'll tell you my experience, and let me ask lots of questions and understand yours. Why are you doing it like that? Either we did this, but could you do that? Is it even possible? There are a lot of things that we could do in South Africa that we couldn't do in Rwanda. They didn't have the money because these are small scale mines, or there are different reasons for things. So it's just getting out into the field, talking it through, asking questions, doing it with people. I know that's my ideal approach, if it's possible. Yeah.
So from all of this research and work, is there anything in you that's starting to develop outside of the framework of what's been built?
Yeah, I definitely feel I have a fairly unique voice because of my experience. It's quite unique to. I've kind of worked on many of the sides. I've worked in the mining industry and I've lived in a mining community, so I understand that viewpoint. I've worked with the Rwandan government. I've sat in government for a year working with them. Now I'm sitting in academia, coming from that perspective. So I've got these different perspectives, and it's kind of putting them all together in quite a unique way. So it gives me this kind of insight, I think, that others just don't have, just because they haven't lived what I've lived. And I think there's this opportunity in South Africa. There's a lot of work to be done, and a lot of bridge building to be done. There's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of people who are not happy and who are scared about the future. And so, I'd like to think I have a part to play in that. And I think it's still developing, still figuring out what that is. But enjoying doing my small bit. Yeah.
Okay, so how do you think we can balance the economic benefits with sustainability?
Yeah, so if we're talking in the mining context, we need mining because of the minerals and metals that are extracted. Everything in this room that hasn't been grown in the ground has been mined, pretty much. So we're all completely dependent on mining, and particularly for climate change mitigation. For trying to have a green economy, we need mining because we need copper and lithium, and we need a whole lot of metal for solar panels, for wind farms, for battery storage. So mining has to be part of this picture. We've got to figure out how to do this in a more sustainable, in a more environmentally friendly way. And that is about sort of being more efficient with water resources, ensuring there's no pollution, or minimizing it as much as possible. There's all sorts of strategies that companies need to think about. But at a national level, the government has to be thinking about what is the best for the economy and what is the best for the people of the country. So if we think of water again, they could say, well, we have very limited water resources. What should we use those water resources for? Well, we could prioritize mining over agriculture, because agriculture uses 2/3 of our water, but doesn't produce as much foreign exchange or as much income. The jobs are low paid. Is that the right decision to make? Whereas mining it's more water efficient in terms of how much income it generates. So there's different ways of looking at resource use. Of course, you want food security in your country. So you don't want to say we're not going to have any agriculture, because then you have to import everything, and then you're really vulnerable to sort of geopolitics and what's happening globally. So there's some very complex decisions to make, and both at this national level, where you've got to think what's best for the country, but at a company level, what's best for this region, these communities, this company, at a provincial level, all the different spatial scales, which is, like I said, I worked on in my PhD. It's you've got to think of, there's different challenges and different questions at different scales that you have to think about.
So then how do we make it relevant for the person on the street, like just the regular person? Because it's easy to go to the corporates and like, here's the data, this is what you need to do in 2 years. Now, how the guy on the street, like, how do we?
Yeah. So again, it depends on who the guy on the street is. I think there's some people who drive a car that produces a lot of emissions, they have a big carbon footprint, they travel overseas twice a year. Like, how you approach that person is going to be very different to how you approach someone who's living in a rural village, using 30 liters of water that they've collected from the stream, having almost no impact at all in terms of an environmental footprint. Those, again, there's variation in who you're talking to. But I think with everybody, giving them the information helps. There's interesting research being done on behavioral economics at UCT and other universities on water, and saying if you give people more information about their water use, will that change their behavior? And it shows that it does. If you suddenly realize how much water you're using or what the impact is, you change your behavior. And we saw that. Anyone who lived through that Cape Town drought, suddenly the city was communicating with us. They were explaining how much all our appliances used, how much water everything used. They were giving us ways of dealing with it, how to use less water. It was an amazing communication strategy, actually. And we dropped down. No one in the world has ever done what we did in terms of reducing our water consumption on average from 250 to 50. It was a massive shift, and it avoided day zero. So it's about communicating, but targeting it to who you're talking to. What is their context? What do they need to understand? What can they do about it? There's also, I think, a huge challenge with the climate change movement over years, 20, 30 years, is we all now know it's bad. There's this big problem. Sea level's going to rise, icebergs are melting, but people feel helpless to, like, what can I do on my own? It's so, and then sort of people give up because they think, oh, it's too big, it's too hard, I'm just going to ignore it. And then there's other people who just literally are just trying to put food on the table. They're just trying to send their kid to school. They actually don't have the energy or time or capacity to worry about all these big global issues. Like, you cannot expect them to take any, responsibility or role in these global problems.
So it's clearly, it's a matter of awareness that actually gets people going. So why do you feel like we're doing enough in terms of that awareness now after that? Because every time, obviously, there's that Cape Town situation, when there's a big moment, everyone rallies and everyone's on it. And then after everyone tails away, goes back to their regular usage. Yeah. Do you feel like enough's being done then in terms of keeping people aware of these challenges?
Well, I mean, that's human nature to do that. And you can't spend, again, there's a question about what are you spending your time and resources on. You can't constantly tell people about this, because also then they get, we have people in communities where you do a lot of research get research fatigue. They just get very tired of talking to anybody about any of this. And you get the same with, if you every month were told to save water, you would start ignoring it and stop saving water. But there are places where we definitely could be doing more in terms of the communication and the awareness raising. But it costs, it's time and money, and so each context is different. We were facing an extreme situation in Cape Town, so we had to, and there was a massive campaign, and that was definitely the best thing to do. But where there isn't a crisis, then it's very hard to motivate that. Yeah, we are crisis driven, I think. Yeah. We waited like load shedding. Yeah. I mean, it took us to get to stage 6 for how long before suddenly everyone put up solar panels. I mean, we've all known for a long time that this country has amazing solar resources. I mean, one of the worst parts of the country is better than like the whole of Germany, and they're full of solar panels. So we should have been doing it for years, and it took this absolute crisis of load shedding for people to go and install solar panels. Yeah. So I think that's just human nature.
I hear you, but I'm pushing on this because when you think about it, technically we are at that crisis point, like we're heading to tipping point. So shouldn't it be at that level anyway, where we should be plugging in all our resources and everything, even if we feel like people might get the research fatigue to actually help? You think there'd be any benefit in doing that at all?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, we're hitting a lot of tipping points. I mean, if you look at biodiversity in water, the government's had a program for years on sort of measuring the state of our rivers and all our water bodies, and developed a whole sort of categorization system on what level they're at, and come up with sort of this measurement of what's from pristine, like it's a natural state, through to it's so degraded, like we could never get it back, kind of thing. So it's incorporating this tipping points and thresholds idea. But then what's interesting is then they go out and talk to communities and people in these areas for like each water body or river basin or whatever, and say, okay, well, what would you like? What's your vision for this water body? What do you think we should do with it? So not just say, so there's this risk from a conservation point of view. They're saying everything we must try and get back to its original state, because realistically we can't with most things. But yes, we want to protect our biodiversity. We don't want to see animals go extinct. You know, we want to protect it. But in some cases, the people in the communities are going to say, no, we don't care. We just want to be able to use the water for economic activity. And so they've gone around and rated all these different water bodies and said, oh, this is where we are, but actually where we want to go varies, because each community has a different view, or each person, and then you'll get variation in the communities. Also, we talk of communities like they were this homogenous group where everyone agrees, which is not the case. But I mean, so people have different views on what we should actually be doing with the water resources or the conservation areas. Should we really be protecting them, or should we just say people need jobs and people need income, and that's more important for them? You know, and that's a huge debate, globally, nationally, locally, which we're not going to resolve that this morning.
So do you see a way forward in the world in terms of?
Yeah, I mean, I see so many positives, and I think something that I'd like to do more with my research is highlight the positive things, because often people look at the situation. So take the just transition. I'm doing lots of research on that at the moment. And in a recent project meeting, the one project partner just, looked at all of this and said, this is all so bad. Like, the mines are closing, jobs are going to be lost, the climate, we're not doing enough on climate change, the government's not doing enough. Like, you could look at it and say it's all bad. But actually there's so many positives that you can find as well. Like, there are mining companies working with communities to do skills training and, make sure that when the mine closes, there will be a future. There are mining companies working with governments to build up capacity in local government, so when they leave, they can keep running the wastewater treatment plants, all the things they've set up. There's a lot of, you can find positives everywhere, and that's what I saw, particularly when I did the research on planetary boundaries. While yes, we're facing these massive challenges, there are these centers of excellence in the country. There are these people who are so committed and passionate and just doing their best for our country, and it only takes one or two people to really shift things. So I see a lot of potential and a lot of positives, and it doesn't need the whole country to do this. It just needs a few of us to keep on doing what we're doing.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so is there an integrated model? Is there an integrated model between the donut and the planetary boundaries?
Yeah, so the donut incorporates the planetary boundaries as the environmental ceiling. It's exactly the same. So as there have been updates to the planetary boundaries since it was first published, and so that updates the donut. But what I did was adapt it for South Africa. I was also involved in a project adapting it at the regional scale in China. And what we're seeing is it's been tried all over the world in different countries and at different levels. And particularly, there's a big focus now on the city level. There's a donut economics lab that is being sort of applied, and they go out and work with cities to say, let's apply this donut thinking at your city scale. and what does that look like? It's particularly being done in northern countries, but in the global south as well. So it is being taken and used in different contexts in different ways, and it's adaptable because if you just boil it down to the concept that there's this environmental ceiling we don't want to cross without bad consequences, and there's a social floor we want to get people above, and you don't get into all the very technical scientific details. I mean, that you can talk to anybody about. So it is being done and applied in different ways. Yeah.
So do you use that same kind of model in your lectures when you speak to academics?
I mean, I mostly lecture on courses that are open to non-academics as well as academics, so quite mixed classes at the master's level. And so you've got people in industry, people in government, students, just finished their undergrads, quite a range. And I often use that to explain sort of this is the big global challenge of our time. I've always liked planetary boundaries and the donut because for me it captured all these major issues we're facing that our generation is facing. We've never faced this before as a planet, as a society. We've never had to deal with crossing major tipping points and literally shifting the Earth's ecosystems. And we've never dealt with so many people living in poverty when so many are living in such wealth that they're pushing the planet into crisis. So it's a very unique time to be living. And that donut and planetary boundary model just captures all that in one picture so nicely. And it's a visual tool. Everyone can relate to it. It doesn't matter what language you speak. You can look at it and you can understand it conceptually, because it's this great visual picture of what we're facing as a generation. So, I quite like it.
Okay, so I can tell. Okay. And do you have any final words?
Sure. I think it's just that all of us can play a part. We can all do something. And also to try and do it with looking for the positives. I think we can. There are good stories everywhere, not just bad. And let's work together on these and to turn them into solutions and bridges between people. When we work together, we can do a lot more than we can do on our own.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.